I'm Mike Levi. I'm Professor of Criminology at Cardiff University, and I'm here to have the pleasure of talking to Professor Lesley McAra from Edinburgh University about her work and career and about your criminological life. Now, how did you ever become a criminologist or get into criminology? Perhaps you'd like to say a few words about that.
Well, thank you. Well, can I just first of all thank you, Mike, for agreeing to be the interviewer. It's a great pleasure to be doing this with you, and having Scotland and Wales together in the same room. It's excellent. So I think I got into criminology really by mistake, I think. And actually, in some ways, I think coming into criminology by mistake is rather a good thing for criminology. In terms of its interdisciplinary focus and the need for people to come from all sorts of different kinds of backgrounds. I think that rich mix is the thing that makes criminology such a special place to be. So I started off my degree in university doing German, actually, and then in my second year I got involved in certain politics societies in the university. When you went to university and when I was there, you had to become a Marxist in week 1, and then if you were really cool, you became a Marxist feminist by week 2. So I was involved in sort of activist politics at that time at university, and I'd realised that Mittelhoch Deutsch was not for me. So I shifted into politics, and then I did a fantastic course called The State and Public Order, which was about policing and about state and about military. And I did my undergraduate dissertation on Kant's theory of punishment in relation to his ethics. So I sort of did that, and then I went on after that. I got married quite young, had children, and I was doing a PhD with the Open University, and I was tutoring for them at that time, and I was tutoring politics, and met Stuart Hall through that. It was a wonderful, great place, the Open University, at that time in the late 70s, early 80s particularly. And after my second baby, when I came back, the only course they had available was criminology, the criminology D310 at that time. And Gregor McLennan, who was running criminology in Scotland at that point, said, learn a week ahead of the students. So I did. And so I had this sort of critical criminological education through people like John Munsey, Stuart Hall, obviously, and others. And that's how I sort of came into criminology. I then went to work in the Scottish Office, as was then, in government as a government researcher, and then I got my lectureship at Edinburgh after that. But it was a kind of interesting journey, and it was certain particular authors that really made it. The Kant theory of punishment is interesting, and Kant is now a very interesting, quite controversial figure in the context of the decolonial debates that are going on just now. But other authors such as Matson, Lincoln and Drift, which I absolutely loved, and then Goffman particularly. Goffman's work was the thing that was the real hook for me about the presentation of self in everyday life, and things like the asylum, and how your sort of certain kind of identity gets shaped by particular structures which you're in. That notion of those ideas that came through Matson and Goffman have stayed with me actually all my career, and actually are at the moment shaping the way in which Susan McVie and I are thinking about the findings from our research on the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime. So that's quite a long way in.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, and ironically, Goffman dedicates Relations in Public to E. Evans Pritchard, who, on his visit to Edinburgh in 1952, I almost met. So there's a kind of there's an Edinburgh connection.
That's really nice.
to there about, and of course, front stage.
Well, they say Edinburgh is Scotia's darling seat, and indeed it is.
Okay, but so of course, you're younger than I am, but many criminologists in the early days, when criminology was not yet established as an undergraduate discipline, tended to come back to it. I wonder if that's what's partly behind Paul Rock's comment that criminology is a rendezvous subject.
So you come back to it, yeah.
Okay, and what have been your key research concerns over your career?
So, I mean, my major research concern is really about juvenile justice and youth crime, and I'm also really interested in sociology of punishment as well. And I think the sort of key questions around how systems of justice function for young people, what happens to young people who come into conflict with the law, but also actually understanding sociologically how those institutions develop, are reproduced or structured. Those are two key things. So there's both, in some respects, there's both an etiological but also a sociological dimension that I think needs to be brought together. And so those have been the sort of questions that have shaped the most recent research I've been doing over the last 10, 20 years. So those are particularly interesting questions for me, and theoretically really interested in labelling theory and symbolic interactionism. Those are particular areas of interest as well. And of course, for the last 25 years, I've been co-director of the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime with my colleague Susan McBee, firstly with David Smith, who was one of the founders of the European Society of Criminology. He was the professor when I came to the university to set up the Edinburgh study, and I was the co-applicant with him, and then when he retired I took over as the principal applicant for the study, and we somehow managed to keep it going on a shoestring for 25 years, and that's been one of my major concerns, and also has created a very strong bond with my collaborator Susan McBee, and we write together as McAra and Vic McBee is a kind of thing, one of the academic marriages. She's my partner in crime, so to speak, so that's been a great joy actually for me. So those have been the concerns, and I think that the study itself is interesting. It's had a lot of policy impact, and that's also an interesting thing about Scotland particularly. Over the years, Scotland has had, I think, probably in the UK as a whole, administrative criminology got quite a bad name in certain quarters, and a sort of sense that maybe criminologists were selling out to government if they got involved in government evaluation, etc. But in Scotland, there's always been there's been a close relationship, but also a critical friend relationship with government. And I think that even in the 70s, well before I was a criminologist, there was quite a lot of influence in terms of the central research unit that existed in the Scottish office, as was with Jackie Toombs, fantastic, great figure, great character in criminology.
And a fellow student of mine. And
a fellow student of yours, so there's more connections there. And Jackie actually funded from government quite critical researchers, and their research flowed into government policy. And so I think that kind of critical friendship didn't necessarily exist always in England in the same kind of way. And so therefore there's always been I suppose more porous relationship. It's not always been easy, but a more porous relationship. And our study during certain years post-devolution did not have any traction because of kind of the ideological imprimatur of the post-devolution government to begin with, but actually has had a lot of traction recently. And I think that, for me, the sort of reduction in some of the numbers of people in prison, young people in prison, things that we have managed through our research going into policies that then had that kind of impact, that's something I'm deeply proud of. And I never thought that would be the kind of criminologist I wanted to be. But so the rates of young people being sent to custody are now down by 98% in Scotland. It's a massive reduction, and that's come about through a kind of concerted effort with the Scottish Government now to divert people away from formal measures, put early and effective intervention in, and not to criminalise young people through formal systems and do other things like raising the age of criminal responsibility, which is not tremendously high, but our research was the principal evidence base for that move. So being able to do that kind of thing, I think I've really enjoyed. But I do want to talk about Jackie. I do want to talk about Jackie Toombs actually a bit more.
Okay, you talk about Jackie.
Yeah, because Jackie is, I think, really one of the formative figures in my own life as a criminologist. Because when I was taken on Central Research Unit, and actually quite a lot of people who are now, leading figures in criminology in Scotland were actually Jackie's gals. You thought my girls, Jackie's girls. So Michelle Burnham, Susan McBee, me, and actually a whole cadre of others who began life as a Scottish office researcher and then went into the academy. And Jackie had that great kind of capacity building strength to her that she really did make a huge mark on criminology in Scotland. And she took me out, and when I was doing my first field work as a Scottish office researcher, she came with me, and of course she knew everybody, so we'd sit down talking to the Sheriff Principal in Edinburgh, and Jackie and the Sheriff Principal would be lighting up and having their cigarettes, and then she was letting me then interview this person. She was there as my sort of mother figure. So she was tremendously important in my life, and just a great energizer, and taking a kind of critical edge. And I think one of the things that has been a pity in Scotland is that the Central Research Unit, which was then full of these lots of very interesting researchers in their own right, who were publishing in peer-reviewed journals, were encouraged to do that kind of thing. We were managing and doing research. They got rid of that function around about the same time as the Home Office in England got rid of the research unit there, and it became analytical services. That just doesn't cut it in that sense. So I think that was a shame. But Jackie has her contribution to Scotland and beyond Scotland has been immense, and I really do want to pay tribute to her, sort of supporting me in my very early stages in my career.
Well, that's. It's very good. I mean, at one level, you seem to be arguing that small is beautiful.
Yeah.
On the other hand, for many of our Eastern European countries, might argue that small is actually quite problematic. So I don't think it's a universal model, but what it does show is that if you give people a kind of stake, and if you've got the dynamic culture that you had, then it can work as a force for good. I wouldn't say the same has been true of Welsh criminology, but that's but that's not something I'm going to ask you about.
No. I felt one of the things I would say about Scotland is actually quite interesting in terms of its development, in terms of policy, in terms of its criminal justice institutions, and I think Scotland has been in some of the sort of bigger debates. When I first got into my lecturing years, everything that was written about in terms of sociology of punishment, if it mentioned the UK at all, it was talking it mentioned the UK at all, it was talking about England and Wales. And so it's taking England and the UK as one and the same thing. And I think the one thing I do feel has been a success in my career is actually putting Scotland a bit more on the map about how interesting it is. Now, in terms of smallness, I think it's a small jurisdiction. I think there's something interesting about the kind of relationships that can be developed between the academy and government, and also between the kind of key players in criminal justice. We have a thing called the Scottish Association for the Study of Offending, SASO, which brings together everybody, so academics, it brings together the judges, it brings together prosecutors, the police, come together for an annual conference, and then there are lots of branches and there's lots of seminars. It's very active. And that's something in a small jurisdiction where people know each other, it makes access easier. And I know I've talked to Mike Maguire was saying, you have it so easy in Scotland, how do we get that kind of traction in England? But there are risks in that too. There are risks of too much of a close relationship. I think one has to be, when we're dealing with government, we've absolutely got to be at arm's length in terms of critical friendship, because if you have people who are dependent on government for funding and have that very cosy relationship, and also with some of the pressures in the United Kingdom to have research impact for the research excellence framework, where we're assessed on our research, if impact becomes something that money is associated with, having those close relationships and being cozying up can then give you more impact. That's really dangerous. So that you've got to always be, and to use that that term, truth to power, you absolutely must be that, and you must have that distance. And in a small jurisdiction, that can be problematic, and things can change terribly quickly. In small jurisdictions, and there can be a quite rapid change rather than more complex differentiated systems, and sometimes it's not always for the best. And as you're saying, there are other states across Europe where it's not such a happy environment, so to speak. But in Scotland, post-devolution, we had a period of a Labour Liberal coalition government.
Perhaps you'd like to tell the viewers when devolution happened.
Okay, so devolution happened in 1999, and there was a referendum for that, and so Scotland got its own parliament. It got its parliament back actually since 1707, and got a parliament back, and we have quite a lot of control over most of the criminal justice system. In fact, nearly all of it, apart from drugs. Drugs still remains a reserved matter, so we don't have control over drugs policy, which is a shame.
Well, I was going to add that you may have been successful in juvenile justice, but drugs deaths in Scotland are
yes, indeed.
very high.
Yes, they're very high
compared to the rest of Europe.
And one of the things that's inhibiting our capacity to deal with them better is the fact that the drugs is not a default matter, so it's a reserved matter. So things that we might want to do, like getting special safe places for people to use heroin, we're not able to do that because it's seen as illegal from the UK government's perspective. So yeah, that's a problem. I mean, it's not everything in Scotland is really great. I mean, I've been talking up here. It's not really great. It's very good in juvenile justice terms at the moment, but that's very fragile. The SNP, the Scottish National Party government, which is actually a very progressive centre-left party, it's not nationalist in the sense we might use that term elsewhere. They have been in power for 15 years now, and it's looking likely that Labour will start coming back through the fore, and they are being much more punitive rhetorics coming along. So it's not that cosy. The other thing that's interesting about Scotland is it's got all these sort of social work instead of probation. It's got the children's hearing system, which is very well known for being a very progressive way of dealing with young people who come into conflict with the law. But it's also got quite a high imprisonment rate. I mean, it's got the imprisonment rate for juveniles under the age of 18 is coming down absolutely dramatically. There's hardly anybody left. There's only about 12 people in the Poland, our main young offenders institution, as we speak, who are under the age of 18. And they're hoping to abolish it. There's an act coming along to abolish it. The Care and Justice Bill is going through the Scottish Parliament now, so there'll be no custody if that bill gets through for young people under the age of 18. They'll be dealt with other measures. And yet the adult population is growing and very large. And that's a really interesting, that raises interesting questions about how far Scotland really is exceptional, is exceptionalism. And there's been a bit of debate. And actually what's interesting, one of the people leading the debate is one of my PhD students, Louise Branken, who's an absolute rising star in criminology. She's fantastic. And she has done her research on Ireland and Scotland, and saying, well, if there's a very high imprisonment rate in Scotland, how can you be claiming there's some sort of exceptionalism about Scotland? And I would say that perhaps the exceptional thing about Scotland, in Scotland, is the high imprisonment rate for adults. That everything else is actually exceptional, but that's the one thing that isn't. And that also brings me to a question that my great friend and PhD supervisor, and somebody else who I owe a lot to, Peter Young, that he was always saying, why is it in criminology we always look for the most extreme and get all our theory around that? So prison is the least used, the most extreme, well, not the most extreme, but one of the more extreme forms of punishment, and the sociology of punishment is completely focused on that, whereas actually the most common disposition in most places is a military penalty, fine. Yeah. So why are we thinking about that? And then equally, why is it, there's this, we spend lots of time shaping our theories of offending around people who are the most serious and violent offenders, when actually the vast majority of people do get involved in offending, and mostly it's very petty and low key. So why don't we have theories of that? Well, we do, but why is theory not really focused somewhere? And it's so that kind of, I don't know, it's where the focal point of thinking is often at the extreme and little used end. And I think that's interesting.
Yes, well, it is interesting. I mean, I could ask you about fraud, but but I won't. Another thing that you've been involved in quite a bit lately is the Oxford Handbook of Criminology, which, full disclosure, I am the co-author of 2 articles. Not enough, of course. But perhaps you'd like to talk about that and its role in the criminological firmament.
Well, that's a very interesting way of putting it, in the criminological firmament. So actually, so I am one of the, I think we still think of ourselves as the new editorial team. So there was one editorial, there was the first editorial team that went on for years, and then, so that was Rod Morgan, Mike Maguire and Robert Reiner. And when they decided to retire from this book, they handed it on. We were specially selected by them to do this, by Alison Liebling, Shamaruna and me. And it's been really fun and quite an interesting journey in terms of trying to put together this collection that has an interesting status, especially in the UK, I think. I mean, when I first became a criminologist and I got hold of the very first edition of the Oxford Handbook, I thought, oh, I would love to be in this book. How can I be in this book? I'll never be in this book. And everybody...
I was always in that
You were
book.
always in it. But it's a sense of it's getting the best of the best in criminology to write an extended essay, even though actually our editorship, we've cut it down a little bit, made people write slightly shorter essays. But it's trying to get the best of the best to write an essay about their field, to say what the state of the plays in their field, and also to drive a certain argument and reflect on their own research in the context of that article. And it's seen as by the publishers as a kind of a textbook. They're really pushing it as a textbook. It's a textbook for advanced students, so graduate students or PhD students. It's not an undergraduate, well, it might be a sort of what we might call honours level or a more advanced undergraduate level. But it also, we kind of feel, and I think it's always played this role in UK criminology, as the state of play in UK criminology, and it's both reflecting the state of play, but also agenda setting too. So trying to kind of push forward and thinking about what are the themes in the future that we need to be thinking about. So we've kind of used our editorship to do that sort of constitutive role, as well as, so it's mutually constitutive in terms of reflecting the state of play, but also pushing forward a little bit. But one of the things that we've been discussing as an editorial team is, what's its purpose going forward, and can you have such a thing as a UK or an Oxford handbook or a British criminology? Is there such a thing as British criminology, particularly in the context of the European project, or European projects? And does it make sense to talk about that when so much is transnational or international, border criminology, or criminology of the South, all sorts of new criminologies also emerging that aren't necessarily located within the UK. And many people who are working here are not from the UK, and many of the things that we want to talk about, like border criminology, are dependent on much wider international research. So whether it makes sense to carry on with this, I think it's a moment, I think, where it has the Oxford Handbook, reached peak. Is it peak Oxford Handbook at the moment, or is it going to go into decline? And I think I don't know, maybe those are really important questions that it's good that they're troubling us about it. But anyway, it has a wide readership, and it's been really fun to edit. We've approached it like a research project. And it's also been fun working with Alison and Shad, and many of our conversations, inevitably over Teams over COVID, but at each European Criminology conference we've managed to hook up and talk about the project, and we began in Budapest. That was our first chat as an editorial team, so it was fun. But yes, it's an interesting question about, is there such a thing as British criminology? I don't think so. There's criminology that's done in Britain, and there are things about our specific institutions, like, for example, Scottish institutions that are kind of would be British criminology in that sense, but they're not. It's in comparative context. It's thinking about it in the wider world. So I'm not convinced there's such a thing as British criminology anymore, or even Scottish criminology for that matter.
But of course, one could raise that question, particularly for the ESC readership and viewership. Is there such a thing as European criminology? I mean, clearly there are European institutions, and there are European research institutes such as Horizon, which the UK, we're probably both glad to say, has agreed to rejoin.
Thank goodness.
Yesterday. Are the boundaries of Europe, are they, first of all, too narrow, or secondly, too wide?
Yes. Given
what you were saying about Scotland versus England, or England and its colony Wales, but one could raise that broader question about any, even the US, has a kind of imperial role, as well. So I'm not sure. I mean, Oxford, sounds very narrow and sort of Anglo-centric.
Yes. Well, it's trying to. That's the thing about the book, is whether you can actually draw a border around it and be Anglo-centric. And if you are Anglo-centric, what does that mean about the kind of knowledge that you're trying to curate? And that's the question. So we have Katia, who's Franco, who's in the volume, who's writing about Europe, and that's great, and that's necessary. And I think beyond talking about the functioning, people are writing about the functioning of the institutions across the United Kingdom, and the differences in the jurisdictions. That's one thing that is clearly a bounded thing. There's so many other subjects, in your own subjects, for example, which simply are not necessarily, local or parochial. You have to think about that in a wider context, and where do you draw those boundaries? I think it's a really interesting ontological and epistemological question about what is European. for starters, because that could mean all sorts of things. So I think it's a contested thing. I don't think it's necessarily, you have to bound things somewhere and there are borders somewhere, but those borders are always porous and need to be crossed. So it's a really interesting question.
Yes, not necessarily in small boats. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the prizes that you've won.
Yes.
You're a very modest person by nature, and I share that. But you've had your fair share. Would you like to speak a little bit about
my prizes? These are the prizes that I've won have been with Susan McVie. Susan McVie and I have won prizes and it's for research impact. So that's why I was saying that I didn't imagine that was the kind of criminologist I would become. When you're young, you think you're going to write the book and you'd be theory driven, but actually I'm much more interested in questions of justice and justice in practice, so praxis. So Susan and I won the Howard League Research Medal in 2013 for the impact of the Edinburgh study. And that was we felt deeply honoured. We won the Howard League Medal for research impact, and it was for new thinking and radical policy change. So that was actually, we felt very proud of that actually, and humbled to have won that. And then we also won, the university started a Chancellor's Award for Research Impact, which we won in 2016. And then in 2019, this is where we actually beat Cardiff. We won the 2019, the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council's Prize for Outstanding Public Policy Impact, and that was for raising the age of criminal responsibility. And we were up against Cardiff. We were the two sort of finalists. And
so two people on the sort of British periphery.
Yes, that's not the periphery, and not marginal. So that was good. But on the other hand, it's not really the prizes that matter so much. It's more that I suppose it helps give recognition to something. But it's actually the impact's the thing that I'm most proud of in there. And what we're doing now is trying to campaign for the age criminal responsibility in Scotland to be raised even further to around about 15 or 16. And both Susan and I are involved in government working groups, bringing research evidence into those discussions. And this is the thing that's going to be really fragile, because if Labour win the next Scottish election, which is not due for another 2026, I think, 25, I'm not convinced that they'll want to move that, but 12 is better than 8, and 12 is certainly better than 10, which it is in England and Wales still, and Northern Ireland. So.
Which brings me to a question that I'm sure you've thought about the role of the media. Now, the way you've been talking so far has focused on the interaction between academics, the practitioner community, and policymakers. Many of us outside Scotland are also familiar with the impact of media campaigning, particularly from the popular tabloid media, but also from others, as affecting the climate for that kind of thing. Is that less of an issue in Scotland?
No, it is a big issue in Scotland, and I wouldn't say that we escape from some of the red top newspapers and their lurid headlines.
Red top are very popular in newspapers.
Yes, so interestingly, I think one of the things that has happened in Scotland over the last 10 years or so has been the way in which youth justice and youth as a problem, which often features on these lurid headlines, has actually been quietened down. And there was a period post-devolution. We had, as I said earlier, this Labour Liberal Democratic coalition government that really ratcheted up the problem of youth crime, and you would get huge headlines like NEDs. So NED, N-E-D, NED was the name that was a label that was attached to young, it was non-educated delinquents, they called them, NEDs. And the NEDs, had their big lurid headlines about NEDs, and that was sort of ratcheted up popular fears about youth crime. But actually, once the SNP government came into office for the first time in 2007, they just cooled that conversation down, and there's very little in the newspapers about that now, unless there's actually been some very specific case, like there was a murder on Bute quite recently that really hit the headlines. And that's of course always the issue about progressive policy making, is it only takes one thing to suddenly send it off kilter. So, but I do think we do still have problems with the media in Scotland. Susan and I once, I'm really proud of this too, the Daily Mail, which is one of these newspapers we're talking about, they once did a league table of academics who state the bleeding obvious. and Susan and I were on that. I think we were 7th in their league table of 22 academics who stated the bleeding obvious, because we were arguing that if you end up getting excluded from school, that's one of the predictors of ending up in prison in our study. And they were saying, once an ed, always an ed, it's bleeding obvious. So that was quite fun. But it is really a very...
Were you disappointed you only managed 7th?
Yes, I think yes, I thought I wanted to be first, but obviously it wasn't important enough. Not too bleeding obvious.
I mean, in my area of corporate crime, of course, a NED is a non-executive director.
Well, there you are.
So you could...
no comment there.
But well, it's an extremely interesting set of issues. Perhaps before we kind of close, I might ask you about the other leadership roles that you've taken on in your career. Tell me a little bit about them and why they've been important.
So I've always felt that universities themselves can be places they have great possibility for doing social good. And so when I've been in university and moved through my career, I've taken on certain leadership positions because I felt there's things you could actually make the university do better, and you could have influence there. So I became the first woman to be the dean of the law school at the University of Edinburgh for 300 and something years, over 300 years. I've never had a woman in this role, and although it was a head of school role, I applied for it because I felt it was time that a woman did it. We'd had equal numbers of graduating students from men and women from 30 years before that, and they'd never had a woman in that role. So I applied for that, and that was really, I thought it was good. It's good for the school to be doing that, and I also really enjoyed that role in terms of being able to then get clinical legal education a bit more on a firmer foot within the law school at that time, and supporting, doing this pro bono clinics, which had been there before, but actually really trying to help build that up, doing a lot of things about staff development, bringing people through early career scholars and trying to support this. So you can do things in those roles. It's not just a role, where you want to be managerial all the time. You want to actually use that role for social benefit. And then I also, when I stopped doing that, I then was appointed to be the what's called an assistant principal role with a kind of for community relations. So it's actually looking at sort of civic responsibilities of the university and getting the university to invest more in its local community as much as it wanted to have an international outlook. So you can do things in those roles. For example, we set up a digital inclusion project where we would go out to work with older people in the community to help them use their digital devices. We've got students involved in that, where made the university put a lot more investment into homelessness and inclusion health. So we set up a centre and help people set up the centre. So you can become an enabler and a catalyser of things for social benefit. And I really think that's an important role of the university. So I've always tried to sort of push away on that kind of side of things. As part of my deanship, I also helped set up the Women's Leadership Foundation for Women in Law with one of our alumni, Karina McTeague. That was to try and support women in the profession, early career women that we'd probably educated at Edinburgh and in other universities, trying to get on a bit in the profession, because the top layers of Scottish legal profession are still very male-dominated. So you can do things that actually can make a difference. You can catalyse the energy of the university, and I really believe in that. At the moment I'm doing a really lovely role. I'm the director for the Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities in the university, and we host about 30 early career scholars from across the globe and some other senior scholars from across the globe come to Edinburgh and have time and space for research. The idea is to bring back a bit of joy into people's research lives, and they get time and space and join a great community. And we're running a project on decoloniality at the moment, and so I'm hosting the university's own Legacies of Slavery project. And I really love those kind of roles where you can actually nurture and bring on the next generation, get people to think about how they can transform. Put in place development opportunities to help those young scholars help transform the environment of higher education at the moment, which I think is a very tricky stage. I think especially in the UK, I think universities could do a lot better. So it's actually trying to use the leadership opportunities you have to change that leadership as it is now for the better. This is more generally in universities, and also help the next generation along, build the kind of qualities that you want that will actually make academia kind of a nurturing and wonderful place to have knowledge production and education. So that's what I've tried to do. Whether I've been successful or not, I'm not sure. But that's what I've been trying to do with those roles. And latterly, my sort of final thing I would want to talk about is being president of the European Society of Criminology, which you so kindly nominated me for. And I'm so deeply grateful for that. And it's been such a fantastic role. And I'm so honoured by it and so enjoyed being involved in it. And even though I had to be president over the COVID year, so I didn't get to do my presidential address in Bucharest as expected because we're all locked down, but we were the only society that year that ran a conference, and we ran the online conference, and I made that happen with all the other wonderful people on the board, including Marcelo, who is just a fantastic person. I really love working with Marcelo, but the past presidents and all the other members of the board. It was just great to have been able to do that. So I'm proud that we did that, and just being a member of this great society. My first conference ever was in Toledo in 2002, and I thought I was quite early career at that point myself, and that was just such a joyous occasion. And so I just love the European Society, and you meet great people, got lovely networks. I've been involved in the COVID network a little bit. But I also have been involved in the juvenile justice one that's led by Barry Golden and Yannicka Christians for many years now, and I just love those networks and what you can do together. And I think there's a real power for good, actually, and the fact that we all come together in these beautiful cities. And being in Florence is fantastic. The view out the window is just stunning here, Mike. You're very nice against the backdrop of the dome.
Yes, that's probably referring to my bald head.
The bald as we say in Scotland.
Well, it's been extremely interesting having the chance to talk this over with you. I'm glad that Toledo put some steel into you. Or you put some steel into Toledo.
It was quite a long climb up the hill, I remember, to get to.
Yeah, it certainly was.
And it was hot.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I first met you. You were there, weren't you, with Gordon and others?
I was indeed there.
And we all met in the square, and Hazel Kroll was there. We knew Hazel, and she introduced us to all these people who, not all of whom were in Wales at that point, but became the Welsh Criminology team. So,
Yes, I mean, I think that is one of the features. I mean, I had the pleasure of being involved in the very first, very civilised and upmarket meeting when we founded the society. But we've been very lucky to have people like yourself, and you've been lucky as well, I know, to do these kinds of roles. Long may it continue. And I think, in a way, it's an object lesson. So you started out by saying, within the first 2 weeks you were a Marxist feminist. I think praxis makes perfect, perhaps. But what I think this shows is that there are many routes to being a distinguished criminologist and a distinguished actor on the Scottish, British and European stages. I'm not sure those possibilities exist very often outside of those spheres. One thinks of other countries, but it's worth, as we reflect on This Is Your Life, it's worth reflecting on the different routes that one can come to this and to play a constructive role in the societies around. Not all academics, of course, would want to do that.
Yes, that's true.
But I think the special conditions of Scotland, maybe help facilitate that, and it's partly a question of how can one reconstruct those conditions, or can one reconstruct those conditions? It does depend on a level of governmental tolerance and willingness to engage in dialogue, which we can only try to do, and you've done so very successfully. We can only try to do, and sometimes you don't succeed, but I mean it shows in the final analysis. Political conditions
Political conditions matter, and actually that's also why interrogating political conditions matter. I mean, we weren't always successful. When we had this difficult period in the early 2000s, we had, civil servants who would try to bring research to government, and they would say things like, "I don't care," they're not interested. So it does require and that's why the impact agenda is so difficult and pernicious in some level, because it really depends on the quality of the government that you're engaging with and the ideological bent of that government. I want to just reflect on one other thing that you said there, Mike, about my own particular journey. I think there are many ways of being a criminologist, and mine isn't the only way at all. I mean, there are people who are deeply into theory. There are different kinds of theoretical framings that people have, different kinds of approaches, methodological approaches, and they all have something of value. And I think what's really important is that we don't, so I think there's quite a lot of fragmentation within the discipline, if we can call it. It's not a discipline, but there's a lot of fragmentation and specialism. I think it's really important that each of these areas, they all have something to add, and that we're deeply respectful of each other as scholars. And I have seen over my career, there have been certain battle lines drawn in criminology, and then they sort of seem to me to slightly dissipate a bit. But I fear that there might be some other new battlegrounds being drawn, and that may be healthy in the sense that there is debate, but it's not healthy if there is not respect for other kinds of paradigms and approaches. And I think it's really important that we conduct ourselves in a way which is supportive of knowledge creation and knowledge curation and education, and that we are trying to better the world in some kind of way. I think that's really important. Yeah. Gordon's got a great phrase. So Gordon Hughes is
my colleague at Cardiff,
and he published actually some time ago now. We're about to have an Author Meets Critics session on. I've got it down here, so can I just 2 seconds? I've got a quote from Gordon I really want to say.
Yeah.
So this is crime violence. So Gordon Hughes, his book Crime, Violence and Modernity, he says something which I think is really important for me and how it shaped me. He says, we need to have a move from telling just how it is into exploring how it might be. And I think holding on to that, exploring how it might be with mutual respect, is where the future of the discipline should be going.
Well, that's a very, very good closing note of Scottish-Welsh cooperation, intellectual cooperation, because otherwise we end up with paradigms lost.
Exactly.
And we need to get to his paradigms regained, which was the next part of Mute Inglorious Milton's books, but in his blindness. So we need a bit less blindness in cultural terms, and a bit more respect, and also a bit more willingness to. I once said of critical criminology that I want to start a school of self-critical criminology. We need to continue to be self-critical in your work, and you're an excellent exemplar of that. And it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about your career. I know you're not an egotist. That's not a universal thing, but it's really important for viewers